A few years back, I was really into caving, or to give it a stupid name that no one uses anymore, spelunking. I really didn't think I'd be into it when I first tried it, like I'd have considered myself mildly claustrophobic, the kind of guy who always felt a little anxious zipping a sleeping bag up all the way. I don't know whether it just woke something up in me or it was the rush of getting over a fear or something to that effect, but I took to it like a duck to water. You're somewhere you shouldn't be, exploring parts of the world that very few people see, relying on people, truly relying on them, to ensure your safety and theirs. It's a rush, that's for certain, but it's not without its dangers. So every year, my family and a few close friends head out to a national park or something along those lines to spend some time with nature. And one particular year, I managed to convince them to go out to Mammoth Cave National Park over in Kentucky, which is home to the more than 400 miles of passageways, making it the world's largest known cave system. The cave system is located within the Green River Valley, and its winding chambers, pools, and limestone labyrinths are equal parts beautiful and eerie. 10 different tours offer guests the opportunity to explore the decorated historic and dripstone areas. The cave complex is especially well known for its natural entrance and Gothic Avenue, a passageway filled with historic stone monuments and signatures from 19th century visitors. So that was just about enough history and photo ops for my mom and aunts. The river could provide hours of fishing for my dad and uncles, all the while myself and my cousin could enjoy the caving there. All went well with the vacation, right up until the second to last day when my cousin and I decided to get a little too explorative during a visit to the caves. My cousin was fairly new to caving, so for the first few days, we didn't go too deep or too far. Last thing I wanted to do was freak him out before we'd even done anything worth writing home about. But as the week drew to a close, there was no way I was going home without finding something a little more extreme to traverse. So as we were heading back to civilization after an afternoon's caving, we found a slit just less than knee-high in the rock wall of a cavern. You had to get down on your stomach to fit into such a tight squeeze, but if you did, it led to a small crawl space that cut through the entire rock. After a few meters, I noticed that quartz was growing on the passageway ceiling, and in the light of our headlamps, they glittered in a way that I can't even really describe in words. I mean, it's like something out of a fairy tale, a still from one of those weird Jim Henson movies. It's just magical. So, we entered one at a time, given that the tunnel was only wide enough for one person. The old claustrophobic me would have thought this place was a living nightmare. For real, I'd have straight up had a panic attack and probably died of a heart attack before deprivation ever set in. Every single time you took a breath in some places, you'd feel the ceiling of the tunnel on your back. It was that narrow. But the new me just found it thrilling. Once you get it into your head that these things can't just up and collapse on you, you get this feeling of calm and then one of exhilaration when you realized you were conquering your fears and going places other men dared not tread. The deeper inside the tunnel we went, the more incredible the scenery became. It was like a whole other tiny world, tucked away with the solid rock. But eventually, like most small subterranean tunnels, it just kind of petered out. At one turn there was a dead end. The other was host to all kinds of stalactites and stalagmites. Those are those like rock spike things that you usually see on the roofs of caves, only you get them on the bottom too in most places. I'm checking out the stiles to see if there's a possibility of us twisting through them to get to the deeper sections of the tunnel, when I hear my cousin whisper something behind me, something that honestly made my blood run cold. He said he could feel water on his back. Something was dripping on him. As it turns out, while everyone was having a good time outside, checking out the statues and whatnot, it had started to rain. Only they neglected to tell us that. Thanks, guys. It's also worth noting that the tunnel we were in had sank down into the rock for a little while before sort of flattening out at the bottom. And to save you all a little geology lecture, I'll get to the point. The tunnel we were in was filling up with water. Granted, it was filling up slowly, but the position we were in meant that only a few inches of water could effectively drown us. and that's a real bad position to be in if you don't own a pair of gills. Needless to say, we turned around as fast as we could, which took like the longest time when you factor in how narrow the tunnel was, then began the long, slow crawl back along the flat part of the tunnel. It was absolutely horrific. I tried to keep calm and collected as I could, but hearing my cousin almost cracking up in front of me is something that still makes me shudder to think about. My biggest fear was that he'd just lock up, which scared people are prone to do during particularly grueling caving sessions. For some reason, the brain just decided it doesn't want to take the body any further, and that's that. They can be stuck in the rock for hours before they're calm enough to keep going. I was terrified he'd just lock up, not move, and be the reason we both drowned down there, dying while our family laughed and joked in their marquee tents. But he didn't. That magnificent idiot kept his cool, relatively speaking anyway, and just pushed on. That doesn't mean it didn't get pretty close. It was horrendous feeling the water slowly rising around us, seeing little drops turn into trickles, each new one causing my heart rate to speed up and my adrenaline to surge. By the time the tunnels started to turn upward, back towards the main entrance, the water was almost up to my lips. Moving made these splashing noises, and both of our sets of clothes were completely soaked through. This little incident caused a ton of chaos for the remaining 2 days. My aunt and uncle blamed me for almost getting my cousin killed, and they pretty much took it out on my parents for allowing me such a dumb hobby. We didn't go back into those caves at all, and to be honest, it took me a few months before I even thought about caving again. It hasn't put me off entirely, and I think it did me some good to become a little more safety conscious. But you can bet that I check the weather before caving now, every single time. And if it even looks like it's going to rain, don't do it. It's just not worth losing your life over, no matter how amazing it is. So, at my old high school, there were these maintenance tunnels that snaked for hundreds of meters underneath the building itself. There were the newly built ones, and then there were the old ones that the school didn't use anymore. My friend Katie and I found an entrance to the old tunnels in a classroom that had long since been abandoned. We had to bust the lock on an old trapdoor, unscrew a round metal top layer, and lower ourselves into a square, dirty tunnel. The main tunnels were about 2 feet wide by maybe only 6 feet tall, with maybe a few inches of dirty, stagnant water flooding the bottom. Now, these tunnels were very dark and very cold, with the utterly disgusting stench of stagnant water and old mold. It was gross, but we began exploring the tunnels a little more every day. One time, we were in there for maybe 20 minutes tops when Katie almost passed out from the smell. At least, that's what I thought it was. Turns out that there was some dangerous gases down there. What I found out later were methane sinks that were actually pretty dangerous to those without safety equipment. I had to pretty much drag her out. But the next time, we brought respiratory masks, waterproof footwear, and flashlights, then set about mapping out pretty much the entire system. All in all, we mapped out more than 700 feet of twisting, turning tunnels. It became something of an underground lair for us. They went up, down, and turned to the sides, so much so we had to use chalk to mark the walls so we could find our way back. After a particularly long expedition, maybe like 3 hours, we headed back to where we came in, only to find the opening was actually locked. We pushed and turned on the metal cover, becoming pretty frightened when we found it wouldn't budge. We were basically trapped inside, and realizing that did not feel good at all. We pushed through the tunnels, trying to open each of the 3 openings that we had found over time, but not a single one of them would open. Any panic that had been simmering away before had now bubbled to the surface, and to say the least, we were completely freaking out. We ended up rushing down a tunnel we hadn't actually been down before, hoping it would lead us to an exit. After a while, I kept hearing noises behind us. I told Katie, who was crawling in front of me. We froze, turned off our flashlight, and listened. Sure enough, A steady splashing sound was actually following us. We just freaked out and just made a run for it. Now please bear in mind, we had absolutely no idea where we were going at this point. It was just pure blind panic. After what felt like an hour of frenzied dashing through the tunnels, tripping over pipes and scraping our knees, we emerged into a bigger room. We realized it wasn't a room, but sort of a down section of a much bigger room. As it turned out, there was someone doing maintenance down there with us. We hid behind some old metal stairs, and when the guy left for more tools, we scrambled up the stairs, out the door, and hid in the girls' locker rooms for the rest of the day. We never did find out who locked us down there, or what that splashing noise was, but you can bet we never went into those tunnels again. I've told this one before, but it's definitely worth retelling, especially if I include a bit more detail. A long time ago, I happened to be on a visit to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico with two of my college buddies. So this one particular small cave we decided to explore began with a narrow 15-meter belly crawl. At the open, there was a buttload of cobwebs spread across the cave entrance, but they seemed to clear up after a few feet. Pretty creepy, but generally nothing to worry about. Although I really hate that feeling of them when they touch your face and there are a few dead flies in there or whatever. Anyway, I was the most experienced caver, so I went first and did the belly crawl pretty quickly, pretty much making myself the human shield for those big clumps of old cobwebs. As the tunnel ended, I came out in a small domed room, about 1.5 meters tall and about 4 or 5 meters across. I had some time before my friends made it, so I was describing the room to them, whilst dusting the spiderwebs from my clothes. I looked up at the ceiling and gasped a bit. I'm not afraid of spiders, but the sheer volume of them caught me off guard. It must have been a minimum of like 1,000, all crawling around each other. Now that I think about it, it was probably more like 2,000 or 3,000, all hanging from the ceiling with egg sacs all around them. I mean, they were a legion, like there wasn't a speck of rock ceiling to be seen, as the entire thing was just a mass of 8-legged crawlies. Hey guys, there's a lot of spiders hanging from the ceiling. Don't stand up when you get here, I called to my friends. My friends were considerably more cautious of the spiders and began to ask a few questions about them. How big are they? What color are they? Well, how many are there? And that kind of thing. They're not that big. They kind of look like black widows, but they're not. They're the wrong color. It almost seems like they're brown. Their legs look a little lighter than the body, I said, studying them as best as I could with my headlamp. I was no spider expert, but I knew a black widow when I saw one. But then, a friend of mine, who was a big animal expert at the time and actually went on to be a Wisconsin DNR warden, yelled out, Really? Do they have a small pattern on their back, sort of like a violin? Yes, I replied, already getting a really bad feeling in my gut. Our buddy, the DNR warden, burst into the room, looked up, shuddered, then forced himself to look at one of the spiders as close as he could manage. The color in his face drained out, and he hissed, Get out! Everyone get out of the cave! He didn't say any more. He just rushed to get out of the cave as quickly as he could. It took us all about 10 or 15 minutes to get into the room, and it took us about a whole 2 minutes to get all the way out of the cave. When we finally got out, the other two of us were confused. My warden friend told us that what we were looking at was a nest of brown recluse spiders, some of the more poisonous arachnids on the entire continent, and we had been unlucky enough to stumble across their lair. Apparently when they bite you, you go through excruciating pain for a few days, skin necrosis, and you could possibly die. We didn't go any more caves with cobwebs in them for the rest of the trip. I'm a qualified caving instructor, and honestly, it's not very often at all that I actually get frightened during a caving trip. Now, it's entirely possible that I've never gotten spooked because I'm simply not claustrophobic, nor am I afraid of the dark. I mean, asking someone who likes caving to describe really scary moments in a cave could, but if you asked people who hated caving but were somehow roped into it anyway what was scary about it, those stories might prove a little bit more fruitful. Having said that, there's definitely a few caving trips I've presided over that haven't exactly gone according to plan. I used to do a lot of solo caving, and rappelling down vertical caves was one of my favorite parts of the whole process. I must have dropped into a cave maybe 300 times or more. Last month, I took a small group of Boy Scouts from Michigan into a vertical cave. Being slightly out of practice and not trusting my well-worn gear to keep the kids safe, I ended up borrowing one from a buddy of mine. It was a slightly smaller bundle, slightly narrower in diameter, but it was infinitely more flexible than mine was. I thought this might prove to be a boon, but it turns out I didn't quite think this through, and problems that didn't occur to me at the time began to manifest quickly. Once I was in the cave itself, I figured out pretty quickly that I didn't have nearly the amount of control I was used to when rappelling. I found that I was able to stop, but only barely, sitting over a 200-foot drop while hardly being able to keep myself from sliding. I decided to abort the rappel at the first ledge I arrived at, which was about 30 feet down. I had to lock off my rack and call on those who came with me to help me swing over to the ledge and climb back out. Imagine that, having your life in the hands of a bunch of Boy Scouts. No offense to the little guys, they did the job, but I was pretty worried for a minute or two. I did have climbing gear with me, and I suppose I could have switched over to the other rack, but that would have been a lot more trouble, so I took the easy way out. No, not that one. Since I was able to lock off the rack, I could simply rest there and think about my situation, and the thoughts were not good. The Boy Scouts had their troop leader with them, so it wasn't like there wasn't a strong, full adult there to add some extra pull, but I'll admit that I couldn't help but imagine what would have happened if something went wrong. If I were the panicking type, I suppose I would have been deathly afraid that I would lose my life right then and there, but that doesn't mean the prospect didn't make me feel extremely nervous. I was literally dangling like 30 foot into a pit with gear that wasn't right for the rope I was on, with absolutely no way to control my descent. The only thing is, I'm careful enough that when I decided that the rappel wasn't a sure thing, I chose to call it all entirely rather than risk that I'd have enough control to descend it safely. That's the type of care that keeps you alive in caves like that. But if you want to hear about something that really has the pucker factor, then how about a vertical cave with pull-downs? You take your rope with you, and an unexpected increase in water levels. There's a cave out in Tennessee where there are 3 vertical drops of over 100 feet, but people typically only take one rope because the bottom of the cave is open and you can pretty much walk out of it unless it's flooded. There is always water in the cave, anywhere from ankle deep to about 18 inches. Between the second and the third drop there is a long, 400-foot crawlway with low ceilings and high water levels. When I've been, there was about half a foot of water with about the same amount of airspace above. It's a really nice crawl-through with pretty river petals on the floor and lots of small but clean formations along the walls. White calcite formations, stalactites, stalagmites, and soda straws mostly. Some of the formations are beige, yellow, or tinged with red, showing impurities, of course, which leads to a lot of vegetation during the 400-foot crawl. If, for example, a caver was in a small party who were exploring this particular cave and dropped into it expecting a typical through trip, but happened to have a problem during the second 200-foot rappel, the party could decide to float him through the crawlway and lower him down the final 100-foot rappel. They could pull down the rope and move him to where the entrance to the crawl is, only to discover that the water levels are too high and there is a very small air gap in the crawl. But with water that high, the movement of the water would be very swift, and it may be too much for someone attempting to navigate it to fight their way back upstream. that person would have to contend with just a few inches of oxygenated air at the top of a passage that has razor-sharp rocks all along the cave ceiling, and at the end of the passage the water jets out over to a drop that's more than almost half a mile down. The immense water pressure would try to push them out of the passage, and it would take a great amount of strength and effort for a sustained period of time to be able to resist that water pressure. And honestly, it would not take long to exhaust someone, and when they run out of strength, then it's time for the big sleep. It's likely that the fall would not kill the caver overnight, since the bottom of the drop would be completely flooded. He'd hit the bottom and, in all likelihood, break a bone or sprain an ankle, but the water could essentially break his fall, potentially saving his life. But that's only assuming that he could breathe the whole way down the passage without getting his face torn up by the rocks on the ceiling, and as you can imagine, that's very, very unlikely. If there's one thing you take away from this dumb story about caving, it's that you never, ever go alone. And generally speaking, you don't try to take an injured person out of the cave with small numbers. It's better to leave one person with the injured party and let 2 people go out and get help. That's why the smallest safe party is no less than about 4 people. But with 1 person staying back and 2 people trying to make it out of a flooded passage, there is the potential for lots of drama. I think I can give a good answer to this, as I've been caving as a hobby for several years now. Nothing really supernaturally creepy ever happened during any of my caving events, but I have been in some dangerous situations which have either left me questioning my sanity or the sanity of those around me. So I used to go caving with a group of people from a university club, but I've been out of university a few years and just been doing my own thing. Well, one weekend me and my friend Josie decided we should go on a little trip to a cave with these guys, to see how the old club was doing. The club that taught us how to cave, and we in turn taught the new guys when we were the old breed. So anyway, the trip is going according to plan, and me and Josie go off caving on our own. But one evening, we decided to join the whole group and cave with them in a tunnel system near to our communal campsite. Now, at the time, it was raining a little and I was beginning to feel uneasy about the whole thing. But to be honest, I never voiced my concerns and just went with it. Big mistake. And so it was that a large group of 12 people arrived at this cave system, spending about 20 minutes checking their gear before entry. The particular cave system we were exploring is normally just a subterranean river on the inside, but it has a few levels of corridors that you can explore high above the water itself. The entrance is really tight, though, and requires you to climb down this tight pipe extremely cautiously, using only your feet to feel for stable footholds. There is absolutely no way to see what is below you, and basically if you lose your footing, there is a nasty fall that could leave you seriously injured if you fell victim to it. However, manage to keep your head together, and you'll be fine. So much of caving is winning the battle in your own mind. So anyways, we get to the cave, and the guys in the club are doing their thing. Me and Josie are just the old, salty veterans coming along to relive the old college days. Once we're inside, we realize that there is this one younger girl who's got herself somehow stuck in the entrance at the very rear of the group. Turns out it was only her second caving trip ever, and for some reason, her buddies thought it would be a good idea to bring her into this one, even though she had panicked whilst in a much larger, easier cave system earlier in the week. So one of the team leaders stays behind to help the panicking girl calm down and to get her to advance further into the cave, while the rest of us move deeper, down some of the long corridors before we can start exploring the cave properly. Then I went and asked one of the leaders of the group, a girl I had taught how to cave just a few years before, what time it was. And to my absolute shock and horror, she straight up tells me that she doesn't know, because she's not wearing a watch. Shocked, I ask her how she expects to know what time to leave the cave to be on time for the call-out. For those that don't know, the call-out is arguably the most important aspect of serious caving. It's where you let someone on the surface know, even if it's just a friend who's not even on the trip, exactly who is going to be present on a caving trip as well as what time you plan on leaving. Without a call-out, if something goes wrong, no one will know you are missing for days or even weeks, and will then have potentially hundreds of caves to look over in the hopes of finding you. And in that time, it's entirely possible that you could have died of deprivation by that point. Remember, it takes just around 72 hours without water for a person's heart to just pack up and cease beating. Anyway, the leader of all these sweet innocent beginners tells me that she did not leave a call-out, or bring any first aid kit or safety equipment. I'm literally furious that she's put us in this situation, but I hold my cool long enough because I don't want the others to panic. Because to panic in a cave system is a straight-up death sentence on occasion. But still, I tell her quietly that I am now the call-out, and tope out of the cave by 1:30 p.m. I reluctantly give her my watch, trying not to snap and straight up call her reckless and dumb before I start back towards the cave entrance. Back near the entranceway, the other leader guy was sitting with the girl who got stuck earlier, the same one who managed to get her into the cave. Turns out she just couldn't handle it and they'd abandoned the attempt entirely. I go through the situation with them and tell them I'm leaving the cave to be the call-out guy. They ask me to go get an SRT kit, basically just ropes and a harness, in case any of the other caving club needed it to climb back up, so I do just that. A little while later I head back with gear, which they didn't have all of, and I had to borrow off of other cavers who were luckily at the same campsite. I get back to the cave and the others are leaving, albeit rather slowly as it is a difficult entrance and climbing out is incredibly harder than climbing in. They all manage to get out, but lo and behold, the panicking girl gets stuck. And with the two leaders trapped below her, she is blocking the entrance. We harness her up, and I rig up an anchor to try and secure her on a rope in case she falls, but she is wedged in there tight, and it isn't in the right frame of mind to get moving. Then I get the news from the others below that the cave is starting to fill, because of rain. After what seems like eternity of them nicely talking to this panicking girl, telling her that she's doing great and she'll be fine, she's getting worse at this stage. I freak out. I shout at her that she needs to get herself together and get out of the cave because two others are stuck behind her. It kind of works, and she nearly stops having a panic attack. Not entirely, but stops hyperventilating, which just makes her more stuck. She still won't climb out, though. So against all common sense, I lie down into the hole and grab her by the harness and pull her up and out of the cave. After that, I told the club that they needed to get their stuff together and stop being cowboys, but I haven't gone back to them since, because their foolishness straight up nearly got 2 team leaders killed. My name is Tom Kinski, and I am the vice chair of the Boston Grotto, a caving club affiliated with the National Speleological Society. We meet the first Wednesday of every month on MIT campus and regularly send out open invitations in the hopes of attracting new members. There are always people who show up interested. I'd like to think this wasn't just due to the pizza we ordered in from the upper crust on Charles Street, but who am I kidding? Everyone loves pizza. The Boston Grotto also organizes yearly caving trips to some fascinating, far-flung places. Last summer we planned a deep cave expedition in the karstic limestone plateau of southern Turkey, and we actually helped to map out the lower reaches of the cave system, extending the depth of the Morka Cave from negative 919 meters to negative 1240 meters. It is now officially the 3rd deepest cave in Turkey, all thanks to our hard work and dedication. It's a very, very fulfilling hobby, but caving is neither easy nor is it really relaxing. In fact, on occasion, caving can be hazardous, terrifying, or even fatal. I have plenty of stories detailing brushes with danger and death, but the one I'm about to tell you is the one that sticks with me the most. So a few years back, a ranger from the Glacial National Park in Montana got in touch with the NSS regarding a previously unexplored cave system. Christy Starr, the office manager of the NSS, then referred the ranger to us due to our expertise in mapping out unexplored sections of cave systems. The ranger then got in touch with the Boston Grotto and then basically offered us an all-expenses-paid caving trip to the Glacier National Park. Needless to say, we were ecstatic. You see, whether we're talking about Francis Drake, Magellan, or even Lewis and Clark, we can conclude that most, if not all, of the Earth's surface has been roughly thoroughly documented and mapped out. There is very little in the way of land left to explore, but the same cannot be said for what lies beneath our feet. The National Speleological Society alone estimates that only 10 to 15% of the world's cave systems have been documented and mapped out, and I'm not sure people realize just what an opportunity that presents people like us. We have the chance to explore places that no man or woman has ever stepped foot in before, to truly be the next generation of explorers, carrying the torch in places of ancient sailors, 19th century African adventurers, or even the spacefaring astronauts of the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's the very real possibility of being able to name something the Kinsky Caves or something along those lines. The very real possibility that some of us could be immortalized in the way that Stanley or Abbott had been, giving their names to Port Stanley in Africa or Abbottabad in British India. And so it was that myself and 2 other members of the Boston Grotto ended up driving all the way out to Montana in a van filled with caving gear, snacks, and beer. Given that the drive took a couple of days, we made something of a road trip out of it, stopping off at Chicago to stretch our legs and take in the sights of the Windy City. Accompanying me on the trip was Paul Hutchinson, coordinator of experience-based training here at Boston University, and another member of the Grotto, Nestor Ramos. Previously employed by Lynchburg College, Virginia, Hutch had expanded the outdoor leadership group to include backpacking, rock climbing, horizontal caving, vertical caving, and canoeing, as well as creating an academic minor in outdoor recreation. To others, caving and other outdoor activities were just a hobby, but for Hutch, it was more of a vocation, something he was compelled to do, something that was in his blood. And he brought that same passion to almost everything he did. Nestor, on the other hand, was a relatively newer member of the Grotto, but what he lacked in raw experience, he made up for in enthusiasm and competence. He was a natural in ways that made the younger me very envious indeed. After almost 5 whole days' worth of driving, we finally made it out to Browning, Montana. We stopped to get a bite to eat and then headed further down Highway 2 until we reached where we'd be staying, the Traveler's Rest Lodge, a set of log cabins that were every bit as charming as rustic as I imagined. We slept like the dead that night, and after sleeping in a van for 4 nights, I had never been so appreciative of the divine human invention that is the mattress. The next morning came the trip out to Glacier National Park itself. We packed up our gear, which included our very specialized helmets, light, thin, comfortable, with a 4-point suspension that will stay on in a fall, as well as being safe to mount batteries, flashlights, and brackets to. We threw extra batteries and flashlights into small, utilitarian backpacks, along with extra layers of warm clothing as well as food and water. But then came perhaps the coolest part of the trip so far. Given that the Glacier National Park is pretty much inaccessible to anyone but experienced hikers, the rangers out there had planned something a little special for us to save us exhausting ourselves before the exploration even began. A helicopter ride into the park itself. We were told to be in a certain field at a certain time, which we were, and seeing that chopper coming in from a distance, the thudding of its rotor blades shattering the early morning tranquility, was just incredible. I'm a huge fan of old war movies, and if it wasn't so chilly that morning, it might have felt like we were back in Vietnam or something. Special force guys being airlifted behind enemy lines or something. Despite being ferried deep into the national park via helicopter, finding a safe place to drop us off was another thing entirely. We landed about a mile's hike from the cave system itself, with one of the park rangers guiding us up a set of steep paths which led to the tiny restrictive entrance on the mountainside. We arranged a call-out time for 20:30 that evening, enough time for us to get out of the cave and back down the mountain to the landing site before sunset. After that, the park ranger left us to hike back down to the chopper, and our journey began in earnest. I immediately understood why the cave system was previously unexplored. The entrance was barely traversable, even to us experienced cavers, and more than once I had to completely exhale to make my torso fit through the narrower gaps. Hutch was the point man as he headed in, and each little cranny he had to shimmy through was properly assessed for danger. A larger man might have become stuck, stuck to suffer the same fate as that guy in Utah about 10 years earlier, something I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. After about a half-hour serious anxiety that verged on claustrophobia, the tunnels began to open up a little, and I really do mean a little. They were still narrow enough that we could do nothing but crawl on our hands and knees, occasionally just our bellies, in order to get deeper inside a place that apparently no man or woman had tread before. It was terrifying, but thrilling in a way that I don't think I could put into words. It's like one burst of adrenaline, knowing you're the vanguard of subterranean exploration, and you can almost feel it buzzing in your fingertips. So the last thing I was expecting when we found ourselves crawling into a larger, more open cave was to hear Hutch's disappointment. As you can imagine, you can't make loud noises in a cave system, and you have to be as quiet as possible given the reverberations and echoes can quite easily cause a cave-in if the rock isn't of a certain density. So at first, I couldn't quite make out what Hutch was getting at. I mean, I seriously thought he was injured or something at first. He started hissing and whispering curses, balling his fists in frustration at something he'd seen illuminated by the lamp on his helmet. After he crawled through, I watched him sit down, leaning back against a cave wall with his face obscured by his hands. I asked him what the matter was, but he just shook his head, a melancholy to his body language that I'd rarely seen before as he pointed over toward the opposite side of the cave. There, lying on the cold stone floor, was a burlap sack, a small leather-bound notebook sitting just nearby. Only then did I join him against the cave wall, sorely lamenting the fact that this wasn't going to be the virgin expedition that we'd imagined it to be. But that didn't mean that we were about ready to give up. Not by a long shot. Whoever had been down in this place previously had obviously never officially recorded their findings, so the door for us to map out and name the place was still very much a possibility. Before we pushed on, we decided to search the burlap sack and inspect the small book for clues as to what we might be up against as we moved deeper. As I kicked open the sack, I could see there were the remains of some old food container along with an old-style water flask, both of which were empty. They looked old, extremely old, and I hurried to inspect the small books to see if it had any trace of date inside. The thing fell apart in my hands. Moisture and time have long eroded the page's bindings, but we did find a page where the date was partially legible. It read 1860-something, the last number completely worn away by the damp cave air. The book had been sitting down there for the better part of 200 years, and although we couldn't read a single full sentence of what was written in it, I'd have given anything to know what the cavers of yore thought of their subterranean experiences. As we advanced further into the cave system, I couldn't help but wonder just what would cause an explorer to just abandon their notebook like that. But we soon discovered the reason. 2 caves over, we found them. Hutch called it out as soon as the beam of headlamp passed over the dome of rib bones that jutted out from the rock. It was nothing short of terrifying, knowing they'd come down here one day, never to return, never to see their loved ones again, and all the while their reasoning for being down here eluded us. After that, here were 3 things we saw before we turned tail and got out of there. The first were the skeleton's finger bones. Basically, a person's finger bone is divided up into 3 distinct sections known as phalanges, the smallest sections being in a person's fingertip. These have a really distinct shape. Go ahead and Google it, and you'll see what I mean. So it was pretty evident to us that something traumatic had occurred that wore the tips of the bones away. It felt intensely creepy, speculating on how this guy had potentially lost his way in the caves, probably going mad in the darkness, and began to scratch at the walls of the cave until his fingers were worn down to the bone. And even then, he hadn't stopped scratching. But we couldn't find any sections of the cave wall that bore the marks he would have made, which led us to the second thing we saw before we got out of there. It was a skull. There were scratch marks on his skull, right around the orbital sockets. None of us said a thing about it as we studied the yellowing bone under his headlamps, before it was obvious what had occurred. Down in the dark almost 200 years before, he had scratched out his own eyes. We were already backing out of the cave at that point, praying we wouldn't get lost on the way back, as this poor soul had obviously done. I tried not to think about the moment that poor soul's lamplight had run out, condemning him to spend what little time he had left in absolute darkness. I tried to show Hutch and Nestor, but they weren't in the least bit interested in hanging around any longer, and to be honest, I totally understand why. As we sat around the open field we'd landed at, waiting for our helicopter taxi to arrive, we agreed not to talk about what we'd seen until we got back. There was a good chance that if we told the rangers what we'd seen, they'd ask us to go back in to retrieve the body of the old caver, something none of us were particularly keen to do. And as much as we agreed not to talk about it until we got back home, there never did come a time when we discussed what we'd seen down there, ever. I mean, when the rangers asked us how the caving had gone, we just told them that it was unsafe to be down there, and there was no chance of turning the cave system into a tourist trap, let alone a place for experienced cavers to go when they wanted a challenge. I suppose I've waited long enough to get this whole thing off my chest, so now I suppose everyone knows about the body down there in the caves of Glacier National Park. There was nothing John Edward Jones loved more than caving with his beloved family. Along with his younger brother Josh, his father often brought him along on caving expeditions in the state of Utah when they were just young children. From an early age, the Jones boys grew to adore the subterranean depths and their shadowy, otherworldly beauty. But unfortunately for John, his first trip into the Nutty Putty Cave, southwest of Lake Utah and about 60 miles from Salt Lake City, would be his last. John entered the Nutty Putty Cave just after 8 p.m., Mountain Standard Time, on the evening of the 24th of November 2009, not long before Thanksgiving. John was 26 years old at the time of the incident, and along with 9 other friends and members of his family, decided to explore Nutty Putty Cave as a way to build bonds with each other ahead of the holidays. Being in his mid-20s, John was without a doubt in the prime of his life. He was recently married, had an 18-month-old daughter, and was in the process of attending medical school in Virginia with a view to becoming a certified medical doctor. And like most years, he had headed back home to Utah to spend some quality holiday time with his family and friends. Yet a seemingly routine caving trip was to turn into an outright nightmare. It had been many years since John had been caving, and at 200 pounds and 6 feet tall, he wasn't the same small child that used to accompany his father. After about an hour of exploring the vast caverns and tunnels of the Nutty Putty Cave, John decided to find the formation called the Birth Canal, an extremely tight passage that cavers must crawl through carefully if they're feeling brave enough. John located what he assumed was the birth canal and began to inch his way into the restrictive tunnel, head first, shimmying forward using his stomach muscles, hip flexors, and fingers to grip. But it only took a minute or so before he realized he'd made a horrible error of judgment. Josh Jones, John's younger brother by 3 years, was the first person to find him that way. Josh tried desperately to get a grip of his brother's calves so he could pull him out of the tunnel, but had little success. In fact, Josh only succeeded in allowing his older brother to slide down further into the passageway, meaning he was trapped even worse than his previous predicament. John's arms were now pinned beneath his chest, and he couldn't move an inch in any direction. The Jones family were, and still are, devoutly religious, and at this point both John and Josh began to pray. "Lord, guide us as we work through this," John prayed. "Please save me for the sake of my wife and kids." Before long, Josh had rushed back into the direction of the cave's entrance in search of help. But even once assistance arrived, John was still trapped more than 400 feet below the Earth's surface. Getting equipment, supplies, and personnel down that far took more than an hour to accomplish. Susie Mottola was the first rescuer to reach John, arriving at just after midnight on the 25th of November. By this point, John had been stuck inside the tunnel for more than 3.5 hours. Susie said hi to John and introduced herself as a rescue worker, even though all she could see of him was a pair of darkly colored sneakers. "Hi, Susie. Thanks for coming, but I really want to get out," John is reported to have said. And so over the course of the following 24 hours, more than 100 rescue volunteers worked tirelessly to free John from his rock prison. From records and eyewitness reports, the method they were banking on involved a system of pulleys and ropes to try to pull John free from his dangerous predicament. One of the rescuers on the scene, a man by the name of Sean Roundy, explained the difficulties facing anyone who went into Nutty Putty Cave, even those with lots of previous caving experiences. Most of the passages were dangerously narrow, even at the entrance, where warning signs had been placed. Warning signs that John Jones had apparently ignored or simply failed to notice. But this was not the first incident of this nature that the cave system had seen. 5 years earlier, in 2004, 2 members of a local Boy Scout troop had almost lost their lives in separate instances in the exact same area of the cave that John was trapped in. 2 Boy Scouts had become stuck in the Nutty Putty Caves within just a week of each other, and in one of the cases, rescue worker crews took over 12 hours to free the 16-year-old scout, who was much smaller than John, using a complex series of pulleys. It is interesting to note that the cave had only been reopened for 6 months in 2009 when John and his family made their caving trip. Officials had closed the Nutty Putty Cave system back in 2004, soon after the incidents with the Boy Scouts. The place had been closed off to the public for 5 whole years after a risk assessment had concluded that the caves were simply not safe for unguided exploration. But for some reason, be it political or environmental, the caves were reopened to the public, with only a few warning signs posted around to clue people into the danger that they faced. But now, with John trapped inside a cave that he arguably should not have been afforded access to, time was rapidly running out. The downward-facing position at which John was trapped was putting immense stress on his body. This was due to being in a position which requires the heart to work ferociously hard to continually pump blood out of the brain. As when the body is right side up, gravity does the work and the heart doesn't have to shoulder that load. Much like the Boy Scout rescued 5 years earlier, volunteers tied a rope around John, which was in turn connected to a series of pulleys. When everything was in place, the rescue volunteers then pulled as hard as they could. But suddenly, without warning, one of the pulleys catastrophically malfunctioned. Sean Roundy, the man leading the rescue operation, believed that a pulley came loose at its anchor point in the cave wall, which contained a large amount of loose clay. The rope and pulley operation was a complete failure. The rescuers had no other feasible schemes to get the trapped man out of there. Essentially, John was doomed. Even years after the incident, Roundy had confessed to mentally revisiting the rescue over and over in his head, torturing himself with his own greatest failure. "I reviewed the whole mission," he's reported to have said. "Wishing we would have done this tiny detail differently or done a little sooner, but it's no use second-guessing things. We did our best." With all hopes of rescue dashed and his heart having suffered hours upon hours of strain due to his downward position, John was pronounced dead of cardiac arrest shortly before midnight on the evening of November the 25th, 2009. Rescuers had spent just over 24 hours trying to save his life, but to no avail. And in a show of emotional strength that I could not imagine having personally, John's family actually thanked rescuers for their help, even if their failure meant his untimely demise. Nutty Putty Cave lived up to its reputation on the night of John's death. No one will ever go in the cave again. State officials sealed off Nutty Putty Cave permanently just a week after John's death. They never recovered his body, which remains inside to this day, for fear of more deaths that might result from such an operation. Now sealed up, Nutty Putty Cave serves as a natural memorial and gravesite to John Edward Jones. Hi friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit or Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I'm a closet weeb.